Okay, so this is a Noclip documentary, a little Noclip documentary on the sort of aftermath of Fallout 76, and one of the like key designers on Fallout 76 and Fallout 4 and a bunch of those games. And he was actually in the documentary that they did on Fallout 76, but he ended up leaving Bethesda afterwards and like going to start his own company. So if we do Noclip Fallout 76, making a Fallout 76 Noclip documentary, he's in here a handful of times as one of their like main gameplay designers that they interview. This is him during the Fallout 76 documentary 5 years ago, and this is him now. He started his own little thing. So this is a documentary on kind of what happened and how that came about, which is super cool.
I made my best Elder Scrolls. Like, I'm happy with that. I don't want to do another one. And I've spent 10 years doing Fallout games, so someone else can do that. I've spent 10 years thinking about nukes and live right next to Washington, D.C. That's probably not healthy.
This is Nate Perkypile. You may remember him from our documentary on Bethesda Game Studios.
I didn't need to pull it up. They pulled it up. It's almost like if I watch the thing, I won't waste time doing the thing that they do in the video. Isn't that funny? Isn't that funny?
Perkypile. You may remember him.
I just love seeing behind the scenes stuff on game development. I think this is one of the, is this a Ninja Atomos device? It kind of looks like it. Basically, Ninja devices, I have one somewhere. I think it's in the box back there. But I use Ninja 5 Atomos devices. They're usually used for like really fancy cameras, but you can also use them as capture cards to capture like screen or console footage in crisp quality. You just plug in the HDMI, you can plug the HDMI back out to another monitor. And normally it's used for like really fancy cameras. So you like route the camera output to that box, and then that box records everything. So it has like a slot on the back that a big SSD slides into, so you're not recording just on the camera. And it can allow you to capture in like full HDR. It's really good. It's how most professional operations work. And this kind of looks like one. So maybe this is what the Noclip guys brought to record some of his display while they were making the documentary. I'm not sure, but that's kind of what it looks like.
From our documentary on Bethesda Game Studios, or our pre-release feature on Fallout 76. More on that later. Well, partway through Starfield's development, Nate decided to leave the studio where he had helped create some of the most celebrated and commercially successful open world games of all time. From Fallout 3 to Skyrim and Fallout 4, Nate created many of those world's most iconic areas, and as art lead for Fallout 76, he is partly responsible for arguably the best part of that game at launch, its map.
Arguably is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. No, I agree. The best part of Fallout 76 at launch was probably the map, when it wasn't glitching and you could actually see it and move through it.
Nate was working on an earlier version of Starfield's Neon when he left the studio he'd called home for 14 years, and since then he's been documenting his new design adventure on both YouTube and TikTok. His new project is an open-world hunting game, a combination of his love of heavy metal and a childhood raised in the woods of southern Oregon. The game is called The Axis Unseen, and remarkably, he's making it all by himself. So when I was back in my old stomping ground of Maryland for a wedding during the summer, I grabbed my camera and went to check in on Nate. Not just to see how he's doing post-Bethesda, but how the game was coming along, what it's like moving from the creation engine to Unreal, the pros and cons of...
Oh, I'm excited to hear his thoughts on that. Ooh, this is going to be interesting. It's also like props to him for going fully solo. I mean, it's not like he bounced to another studio and just left. He's just doing his own thing. I wonder, like, did he get a big bonus that helped him fund it? I wonder if they're going to discuss that, because leaving a job of 14 years is like a pretty big leap. So hopefully he had like a big nest egg or something.
Being a solo indie dev, and just how bad the reception to Fallout 76 felt to those who'd been working on it.
I'm excited. This is gonna be great.
I'm working on The Axis Unseen, which is a heavy metal horror game where you hunt monsters from folklore. And I'm doing it all by myself now. Like, it is a heavy metal game, so I wanted to reflect that aesthetic and have something that was like really epic. And there's like the giant redwoods and huge skull sculptures. That mountain that you see is like literally 2 miles tall. But I also really wanted it to play well and not just look like, hey, here's this Unreal 5 game number 5000. So that's why I chose to stylize it. And I actually have almost no textures in the game. Like, it's literally flat colors, but because it is that nanite geometry, like there's still a lot of detail there. Every little tiny piece of dirt.
Oh my
can
gosh.
cast shadows, which is
Oh my god.
wild.
That's the nanite stuff?
Yeah, because it's like they call it virtual shadow maps, and basically what it does is like those are your shadows. You can see like all the tiny little bits there, and it breaks it into all these little chunks, which get even smaller.
Dude, I wonder if this all started because he's like, yeah, I decided to download Unreal Engine one day, and then after trying it for 5 minutes, I was like, I have to quit. It's like I can't work with Creation Engine anymore. That's pretty badass. But that's cool. I mean, I appreciate the desire to make something that looks different because, like I've said, Unreal Engine 5 is very, very powerful, but it's also very easy to use. And that is a great strength and also something that could, I think, cause a brand weakness, which is that a lot of indie game studios and groups of like 2, 3, 4 people are going to make those like abandoned style games, throw them together quickly, and they'll look graphically pretty good, but the game will be absolute trash. And so you're going to start to see, especially in the next few years, a lot of those games coming out that are just, again, the whole abandoned thing all over again. So I think it's going to be important to see graphical delineation and to make your games look a little more unique. And I think it's a really cool idea to have no textures, basically. Everything's just flat, and then you rely on the geometry to cast the shadows to give it a texture, which is pretty cool, honestly.
Smaller, so you can see close up, like each one of those, like that's why it's higher detailed. Because normally you would have it, they would call it cascaded shadow maps, where it'd be like, all the shadows out to here are one level, and then out to there. But that never let you get fine detail without like weird little tricks, like screen space shadows and stuff. But in this case, since they're adjusting it on the fly, that's what lets you have those absurdly detailed little dirt shadows, which is not a thing. And you can see what nanite is doing too. Because ultimately, it makes sense when you think about it. What they're trying to do is render on average, like 1 triangle per pixel.
Right.
You don't actually need more than that. So they just clustered the data like that. And it kind of goes back to like that tech they had on Rage, like the mega texture, but with geometry. That also, weirdly enough, lets me make the game faster, which you wouldn't think. You'd be like, oh, it's like more detailed and stuff. But actually, normally when you're making a game, you have that really high detailed stuff. Then you have to do the low poly version and bake it out and unwrap your model and do all these things to get the game version. But I can just make stuff, and like I use this VR headset here to sculpt things, and I can, like this crazy sculpture that shows up in the game, I did that in like 40 minutes before dinner one day, and I just shove it straight into the game with all that detail. So that sounds great.
It seriously does sound like he has all of these cool tools and things that he's doing. Maybe he was just honestly bored. Like, I've heard of this happening a lot with creatives that make these kinds of games and projects, is that they just kind of get burnt out and a little bored with doing the same thing over and over again. So they just want to go flex their creative muscles somewhere else. I can appreciate that. I can really respect it, because leaving like a safe job that you've been working at for 14 years and then moving to something just much more daunting and scary, but where you can just do whatever you want to do, it's got to be so freeing. And after all the restrictions of working in a corporate environment, I'm sure going to this is just like a whole new world. And you can tell, I mean, he's loving it.
Yeah, so this is the camper trailer, and sometimes we go out on these camping trips and stuff, and I work out of this thing.
Winnebago.
You were always an outdoor kid, like growing up in Southern Oregon?
I mean, I kind of had to be. I was also like the giant nerd, and they're like, get outside. I'm like, I know. But yeah, I was like an Eagle Scout and everything. I went camping all the time. I don't even know how many times I've gone camping. It's like hundreds easily. All sorts of crazy stuff too, like sleeping in the snow like quite literally, like digging snow shelters and stuff. You just dig a hole basically. It's like, oh man, I got snow in my sleeping bag. Gotta like rebuild the whole thing. When I was the art lead on 76 for the first like 6 months or so, I was just scheduling the art team and doling out the tasks. And I know some people have a big problem when it comes to like getting tasks done on time, but I think that's like, I suppose, one of my dev superpowers, is that if I have a deadline, I will hit that deadline. And I think you kind of have to have that when you're making those big open world games like that. It's not how long will the task take, it's how much time do I have.
Right.
And you have to scale the work to fit that. Because those games, you could spend forever on anything. You could always do more. It's also why I didn't crunch. Like, you're never going to run out. You can't. Like, we could have worked on Skyrim for 20 years and like, we'll still add more dungeons, more clutter, whatever. It's like, it's a world. You can add as much as you want to a world.
It goes back to the Todd Howard thing where he's like, we can do anything, we just can't do everything. And so you just got to pick your battles. And that's why I think with a lot of these games, when we do reviews or critiques, it's not often, like, at least the goal should not be to critique the fact that they didn't do everything, but you should rather critique the choices of what they chose to do with their limited resources. My frustrations with Starfield are not that they couldn't do all of these things. Like, Star Citizen is trying to do everything, which is why it's taking hundreds of millions of dollars and so much time. But like, not every game has Star Citizen $600 million budgets, you know? So the reason that we critique something like Starfield is because the choices they made and the things they chose to focus on, in my opinion, and I would argue this, and this is what I've done and argued in the videos, I think those choices were bad. I think they made the wrong choices. They prioritized the wrong things. And that led to a game that was worse than it could have been if they had chosen to focus on other things. The choice to do 1,000 planets with little fish bowls, I think, was the wrong choice compared to choosing to do like 4 planets, but giving an actual world that's generated with seamless exploration or something. Spend extra time figuring out the floating point problems and try to fix that. So instead of being based off of the spawn point of the character, you instead are rendering it based off of the actual current location of the player character. You know, just rework some of that stuff. But that's the point, is that we were trying to critique the choices made, not the fact that they couldn't do more. And it's just an important thing to distinguish, because I think a lot of people who try to critique or review games, they'll start being like, well, and this doesn't have this, which this other game had. And it's like, yes, it doesn't. That's correct. But it doesn't have that for good reason, because it didn't have the resources to do that. They chose to not do that. You can critique the choice, but just blindly being like, see, they didn't have as big a budget as this other company, isn't always fair. And it's why there will need to be some nuance in discussions with RPGs in the coming years, because a lot of RPGs are going to come out and we're going to be like, well, Baldur's Gate 3 let me do this. It's like, yes, they made the choices to allow that, but then they also kind of abandoned the desire to have these other things that this game might have. So there just has to be a little bit more nuance in it.
Yeah, I mean, that launch, I mean, not to beat around the bush, it was like awful. Like, we were like the villains of the internet, like the most hated thing. So that definitely is like pretty tough for everyone on the team to deal with. But I was happy to see that it got pushed into the direction it needed to and had the support. And I think with the Wastelanders update, especially, adding the NPCs, like, most people who play it are like, yeah, I actually like it, you know? And
yeah, the NPCs are a great example, because they chose not to have it, because what Todd Howard said in the lead up to Fallout 76, he said the goal was for the players to be the NPCs. So yeah, they're not the player character, they're other characters in the world, but they're people. But then they paired that with server sizes that were minuscule, like 32 players or something. I forgot what it was at launch. I think it was like 32, maybe even 16, but it was very, very small servers. So it was like you abandon the idea of having hundreds of NPCs in this huge world, which I think they said was like 4 times the size of Fallout 4's map. And instead you replace it with like 15 people, 15 players that don't want to talk to you, or if they come across you, they'll just kill you and try to take your stuff. Or if you don't have the PvP thing turned on, you just like walk past each other. So it was a bad choice. And then they changed their mind. They added NPCs in, and then the game got better, you know?
And it was always nice, frankly, to hear that people would be like, this game sucks and I hate it, but that's a cool map and really cool art. I'm like, nailed it, but that's my job. We knew there were issues and stuff, but expecting that level of volume is another thing. I was one of those people who tried to argue to get NPCs and stuff, but I also wasn't like, this is the worst thing ever, you've like murdered a puppy kind of thing. Like, everyone was trying, so having people react that way is not great.
Yeah. I can only imagine you work your butt off on something and you don't necessarily agree with all the decisions being made, but you're trying, and then to see it still collapse. And I think it probably for the people in Maryland was less bad than it could have been, because there was a misinterpretation and a misunderstanding for like 3 years, where everybody seemed to think that Fallout 76 was primarily developed by Bethesda Game Studios Austin, which was a new team that they built out to basically support this. So I think they got the brunt of it, because most people thought that Maryland just kind of like established this thing as a spin-off while they were working on Starfield. Turns out Maryland was working on this a lot, and they just kind of didn't correct anybody on it because they didn't want more crap. So I get it. I understand why they weren't super clear that this was also them, but it wasn't just that the game was bad and technically a disaster and all that. It was that it was, like Skillup said, morally bankrupt. Like the fact that they knew it was so broken and still sold it to people. That's where, that's why I called Bethesda evil. I said, there's no way to spin this where it's not just evil and toxic, because that's basically what it was. If I know that this car is broken and I try to sell it to you for full price or even like a little bit of a discount, but if I still try to sell it to you and I try to hide that it's broken and totaled, and then you buy it and I run with the money, you would call me an evil cretin. And I think that would be fair. That would be totally justified. But for some reason, when it comes to Bethesda, people are like, no, well, it was just an honest mistake. No, they knew what they were doing, and it's not his fault, to be clear. Like this is why it sucks when the gaming community goes after the core developers, because he just did his job. He was working his butt off with his team. They were doing the best that they could. The blame lands on the executives, the leadership, people like Todd, who knew how bad the game was and still greenlit it to go forward. Like, if Todd really wanted to put his foot down and not let the game out the door, I think he could have done it. He's Todd freaking Howard. He runs the studio. He has a direct contact and relationship with Robert Altman, at the time the CEO of the parent company. If Todd wanted to put his foot down and not let Fallout 76 out the door, he could have done it. But he didn't. Do you guys not have phones level of evil? No, like that was just offering a game people wanted on PC, but only on phones. That wasn't actually very evil at all. This was just like straight up robbing and scamming people, selling them a broken thing, is insane. It was insane. Thank you for subbing, my friend, Ren. Thank you.
But that's also part of where I'm indie now also, because I can not 100% say, but pretty confidently say, no matter what I make and how bad it is or great, I'm unlikely to piss off the internet as much as that ever again. Like, that's pretty unlikely. At first glance, it's like open world game, solo indie. That's stupid. That's probably usually true. But it is, like my 6th open world game, and I really know what goes into them. And the fact that it's like a hunting game actually really keeps that scope in control, because if you look at the number of assets you need to do for something like Fallout 4 with a dense urban environment and all these NPCs, like you're talking about orders of magnitude more stuff and systems complexity. Whereas a hunting game, it's really about having like this big open wilderness to explore. I mean, there are locations, but it's nothing like Boston. And it's hunting monsters. Like, you're not doing these elaborate quest lines, talking to NPCs and having followers. So that helps keep the scope control. So I really just need to do a big open landscape, which is done, a bunch of creatures, which is done, and then make some locations and populate out the world. I mean, there's all the systems and stuff too, but that was like the first thing that I did in my like very early prototype. Like, can I do this? Does this work? Am I going to need a programmer?
That's cool. Like,
I was
streaming
worried
himself
about that.
doing it.
I'm probably going to run into something like, oh, we're saving the game and I just can't do that. I'm going to have to like hire a programmer. But I was like, man, Unreal is great.
It's a great example. Like, he's an artist and like level designer. He's not a programmer, and he's able to do it. Like that's why I've told people, like people will come to me and be like, "Hey, I'm wanting to make a video game. Like, I want to make a video game. How do I do that? Like, do I need friends that can program? Because I'm not a programmer and all this." And it's like, honestly, especially with like ChatGPT now, like it makes it so much more approachable, and Unreal Engine is meant to be much more accessible so that you don't need that. You can just go create stuff, and it's super cool. Luke, if you decide to make an indie game in the future, what engine would you use, Unreal or Unity? I don't think anybody that's working on greenlighting a project in the near future is going to Unity. I think they burned so much goodwill in the last year that nobody's going to give them any benefit of the doubt. So I would be going Unreal. And like I've said before, I have things in the works, but it's a long ways off. Shocker, when you are not a former developer at a AAA game development company, it takes you a lot more time and effort to put something together that you're willing to show to people. And for him, you know, he's been doing this for 14 years, so he knows what he's doing. I don't. So we'll see when I'm able to share anything, if that ever happens. But yeah, we're working on it. We're working on it. Taking time. I hear your point, but like I only have professional experience working with Unity, not Unreal. So there's a learning curve to consider. Oh, absolutely. I would imagine. Everything I've heard though is that moving to Unreal for most people is very, very doable. Like, yeah, there's a learning curve with anything, but it's not that big of a leap because they've designed it to try and get it so people can move from their proprietary engines to Unreal as easily as possible, you know?
I thought it was going to take me like 2 weeks maybe to do the save game system. It was like 2 days. I was just like, here's save this and this and this, load it back up. I'm like, oh, well, that's way easier than I thought it was going to be. I would say Unreal is a lot more open with how you do stuff. Like, even if I want to do a tool in the editor itself, I can make that. Like the same system that you use for doing like the gameplay logic with like the whole blueprint system, which is like a visual scripting system, you can use that to make tools. So everything is like very open and easy to expand upon. You build one thing, but then bring it into another to inherit it. And like all of my creatures are technically based off one master creature that then gets modified for all the 60 different versions. Whereas we didn't have shared properties for most things at Bethesda. So we'd be like, I want to make all the weapons like 10% more damage. Like, oh God, let me just enter all these numbers and make sure I don't mess it up by hand. And spend a lot of time pulling down these builds, seeing if it worked. Oh, nope, it doesn't. Let me roll back. And like that can take a lot of time.
You're telling me a Bethesda employee is saying that the tools are not actually that great? What?
Yeah, I did it kind of like chronologically. So over here you got like Fallout 3, Skyrim, Fallout 4, Fallout 76. Don't really have Starfield merch. And then I laid out all the games that I shipped on that bottom row. And all these like random crystals for like Game of the Year award. I enjoyed Bethesda when it was like 65 people when I started, 110 or so on Skyrim. That was a pretty good number, but once it gets above that, you end up with all these like tiers of management and approval, and had like 3 one-on-ones with producers every week. So I very much enjoy not having so many meetings. Like it made sense when I was like art lead on 76, effectively the art director, having 20 to 25 meetings a week. That makes sense. That's literally the job. Some people are like, why do I have so many meetings? Like, dude, you're in charge. That is the job. But then on Starfield, like I was only in charge of some stuff, like lead lighting artists and like dealing with programmers and stuff like that. But everybody had a lot of those meetings too, because there just has to be more layers of approval when you're talking about like 500 people. And before, a lot of those people had been there a long time. Like the average was like 10 years that people had been there. It's like, we trust you, you've got it. A lot of the stuff in Skyrim and Fallout is frankly people doing what they wanted to do. And that just isn't the case when you have a bunch of people who have never worked on the games and from totally different branches of the company that have been brought into the fold. It's a different way of operating.
And it's something that is kind of difficult to say without like pissing people off. But one of the keys for these games is like, within the studios, is just proper management. Like so much of it lands on management. If you have a really healthy management style and way of kind of establishing timelines and duties and getting all that lined up, like you can get so much more done. But this is why when people are like, well, Bethesda's a bigger studio than it ever has been, why are they seemingly struggling with game design and functionality and consistency of design now more than they were before? It's exactly because of this. It's like there are so many new layers. Like back when they were working on Fallout 3 and it's like 60 to 70 people. Think about like 60 to 70 people. If you like, you know, remember, like think of high school. In like 2 classes, you probably had 60 to 70 people in those classes, and you probably knew all of their names, you knew their personalities, you knew how, like, which cliques they were in, which friend groups they were in, you knew who you'd want to work with for this type of assignment versus this. It's manageable. Like at 60, 70 people, you know what you're dealing with. In the context of like Fallout 70, or rather like Fallout 4, Fallout 76, Skyrim, or Starfield rather, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And so there are multiple layers of producers. There's multiple layers of all sorts of stuff they have to worry about. All of that to say, I think it's important to have those layers of management very clearly established. And it just seems like there's maybe some extra bloat within some of these companies, but it's also just a reality of the bigger teams. I mean, you have to have layers of management when you're talking about hundreds, definitely thousands of employees. And that's one thing I think you do got to give Ubisoft credit for. Ubisoft has well over 10,000 employees, and they're able to pump out crazy amounts of content and massive games relatively quickly. And yes, the games aren't that like groundbreaking, but they still get out the door very, very consistently. And I think it's because they have a system in place. And part of it also is that they set up studios like on other sides of the planet, which is something Larian actually did for Baldur's Gate 3. So their goal was to always have somebody working on the game at all times. Like 24 hours a day, there's always somebody working on the game. So, you know, people on this side of the planet are working, and then people on this side of the planet are sleeping, and then the planet rotates, and then these guys start working, these guys go to sleep. And so there's always work being done. And I think that that's how you can kind of boost efficiency and productivity as well. But just creating these massive games is a huge undertaking. And it's just, frankly, I think it makes sense when you have a game or rather developers like this guy from Bethesda that were there in the early days. It's got to be a system shock to go to a massive team working on even bigger games now owned by Xbox, and there's layers of new management and corporate approvals you have to go through with that just gets mind-numbing. I mean, surely it's just a trudge. It's got to be such a trudge. So I don't blame them. I don't blame them for wishing to go back to the old days. And I think that we've seen that a lot with people at Bethesda. We've seen that a lot with people from a lot of these bigger companies. Naughty Dog was another one where a lot of people have grown kind of frustrated with how it's grown and shifted. So it just, unfortunately, is a reality of the situation. Dylan, so do we have a revolving door of studios in that sweet spot of 60 to 100 people, and then we get successful and too big to keep the magic going? Yeah, basically. It seems like the studios that are in the smaller, more intimate teams, they kind of blow up with these cult classic games, and then as they grow, sometimes they can lose a bit of that magic. There are exceptions. Larian is an example of a team that's massive and has been able to retain that magic and productivity, but the reason that they're so exceptional is because they're just that, an exceptional. You know, they are not normal in being able to achieve that. And same with CDPR. CDPR, you know, I think Cyberpunk 2077 is an example of a company that blew up after The Witcher 3, and then their management approval process, quality control kind of fell apart before they got done with Cyberpunk 2077. So it releases in just a disaster state, and it took them like 3 years to dig themselves out of it. Now it seems like they've sorted through those things, but they talked about that where it was like a process of refinement and getting rid of these managers, reorganizing to try and fix it. It's like a whole thing.
Treble Champ donated £9.99 through Super Chat. Luke, if you want to dig into this a bit deeper, there's something called Conway law. We use it a lot in business around team sizes and lines of communication.
Yeah, I'm down. Let's see. Conway's law states that the structure of a system is determined by the communication patterns of the people who design it. This means that the way in which people communicate and collaborate when designing a system will have a direct impact on the structure of the system itself. Okay. What this also kind of reminds me of is in business school we did a lot of reading on like how Amazon is set up. As you can tell, Amazon is like very, very clearly structured. But what this is kind of an effect of is that Jeff Bezos has very, very clear guidelines for how he wants stuff done, and it's clearly worked. I mean, he's turned Amazon into one of the most successful companies in history. But what he did is that Jeff Bezos, did I say Jeff Bezos before? Hopefully I did. What he did is he established that he wanted teams. It's called the 2 pizza rule of his meetings, is that he wants whatever meeting they're doing is he wants there to be able to be no more people than could be fed with 2 pizzas for the meeting. So he's like, 2 pizzas probably can feed like 4 to 6 people reliably. So he's like, the meeting should never have more than that. Honestly, maybe you push it a little bit extra, but that would allow you to have a meeting with these layers of management, these people. And then if this guy is meeting with his teams, he could meet with these people. And it's enough that they could all sit down, have a meeting that's productive where they can all share their thoughts and it won't overstep those bounds. And then, you know, beneath that, maybe this guy's meeting with this group, these guys can meet with these groups, and so on. So you never actually have a meeting so big that it just can't be productive. And I've had this a lot. Like when I was working in real estate, we had some meetings that were just a total waste of time because it was basically like doing, you know, this. And so barely anybody got to talk except for the big head honchos over here. Everyone else just had to listen, but they wanted it to be a meeting where there was like feedback and collaboration, and it just didn't work. It was a total waste of time. So I think it's very important to have these clear structures and guidelines and systems in place.
Not to say it doesn't work, it's just not how I like to make games. It's
Right.
I suppose I got that indie spirit of like, woo, I do whatever I want. Do you need 500 people, or could you actually have half as much stuff and still be fine? like this is a lot. Like the amount of stuff that goes into those games doesn't have to be that much. Like I know people want their money's worth and obviously want really high production values. And people are like, oh, the cost of games have gone up over time. But on the flip side, I would argue like tools have gotten better. Like there are a lot of things that have gotten more efficient. Like not every game needs to be like games as a service with all these like piles and piles of systems where every game now has a crafting system in it. Like you can like take it down a notch and like get a little bit of focus there still and have a game that I think people enjoy. So this is where I tune all the
1000% agree. And one of the best examples of this that I can point to, I've shown this off on stream a handful of times because I just find it really freaking cool. If you are a fan of D&D, you're going to love this, okay? You're going to love this. He mentioned tools have gotten better. Tools absolutely have gotten way, way better. How Bethesda still does stuff, seemingly, according to people that are familiar with it, is that they hand place a lot of stuff. But I want to show you what you're able to do with like some modern tools, okay? This is called Dungeon Alchemist. This is a tool that can be used to basically craft environments, usually for like D&D games. But you could also use this for game development as well, and there are similar tools for game development. This is just one thing I've been using recently. So if I go like Badlands, we're gonna go in the mountains, vegetation, I'm gonna go, actually we're gonna go forest, mountains, evergreen, clearing, broadleaf forest, snowy, and then I'm gonna put it next to a lake, and the room is on, let's go mountaintops. Create. Look what it just did. It spits this out dynamically. And then if I want to level it up, okay, just like this, I can level it out. And then if I want to just raise it in general, I can do that too. But maybe I'm like, actually, I don't want this much water. I don't want it to be in a lake. I can just go new and then water, no water, snow, broadleaf forest. I'm actually going to change it to evergreen and then we generate that. Then it spits out a very mountainous area. I'm like, actually, too mountainous. Let's just go something else. Elevation, flat, weather, evergreen, clearing, create. I want some empty space. And then it spits this out. Look at that. Isn't that crazy? It just did that casually, okay? Then I'm like, ooh, I need a building. So I'm going to draw this in. And then I want like a big room here. And it can just generate it. Just spit it out. And then I'm like, oh, actually, I want it regenerated. Okay. But then I'm like, actually, I would like there to be a massive hourglass. It has this asset already. I can scale it up. Just like that. And boom, it's in there. Just like that. In a matter of just, a couple of minutes, you just were able to design this with generative tools. Now, granted, it takes a long time to create these tools, but it still like works impressively well. And within game development, there are a lot of tools like this being created all the time. Tons of tools. And I've used this stuff to create all sorts of different encounters or places for like D&D games. And like he was mentioning clutter, in a lot of these engines, you have to go and like actually add in your own clutter randomly. But like if I go broken bowl, you can actually draw this stuff on. So like decay, if I want like some of these tombstones, you can just draw them on. Just like that. If I wanted maybe some food and drink, I just wanted some like bread scattered around, you can just do that. Just draw it on. Oh, some cheese. Toss some cheese in there. Whatever. Like you can just do this stupid quickly. And this is considered like a pretty weak and basic tool, okay? But look how efficient you're able to do. Like, it's crazy. It's crazy. You know? My cup is in focus. It knows the real star of the show. Let's be honest. The camera knows. So what's the name of this? This is Dungeon Alchemist, okay? It's great. I love it. I love it dearly. And if you're into D&D or tabletop games, it's a fantastic tool to use. And so when he says tools have improved, therefore we can work more efficiently and we should be able to do the same that we were doing before, but way faster now. It's true. It's just a lot of these studios are caught in either old habits and old routines of doing things where they'll still manually hand place each object, which is extremely slow, or they just like are not willing to manage their scope and it just gets out of control very, very quickly.
I have all these different materials. I thought, should I put like a tracker in for how many arrows I've shot? It's gotta be like 20 million. I got like little deer guy here to just, can just keep shooting him. Get the little blood spraying out. There's no nav mesh here, so he can't attack me unless I like tempt him. I mean, I grew up with like a bow and we had an archery range in the backyard, so I've used a bow quite a bit. To me, it's like an inherently fun weapon because there's a tension there. People are like, oh, why don't you do like a gun or whatever? Like a gun, you point it and you click. But the bow, you have to worry about like pulling it back and the delay there, but you can't hold it back too long because then you like start to shake. There's a lot of fun there and there's a whole bunch of tuning that goes into it. Like to this day, I'm like tweaking things like how does it drop? How fast does it go? What about the different arrows? Some fly differently than others. I think the closest parallel is to like the actual hunting simulators. You're like paying attention to their tracks and the wind direction. They can smell you also. So you have to pay attention to that, but you slowly get those powers yourself too. So then you can see the scent particles of the creatures. You can like feel how warm the tracks are. So if it's like, that's a really ancient one or it was just there, it's all about like lining up that good shot and trying to approach it a little more methodically, I suppose. Having something interesting besides just the monsters. I don't want it to feel like, oh, it's this big empty world. I want it to feel epic, but always with those approachable goals that you can see. That way you're not bored and you always don't feel lost. And that actually is something I haven't touched on either, is that I don't want the mini-map and stuff. Like the whole HUD in the game, like there is no HUD. Like everything exists in the world. Like if you want to see how many arrows you have, you pull up your quiver and you look. Yeah, it's like that tension and tactile feel. And I just feel like too many games just go deep, deep down this UI rabbit hole where it's like everything has like an icon floating above it and all those things just like really take me out of the game and I feel the design of the game. I think I want a map eventually, like that you can pull up in the book, but to look at. But then, did you ever play Firewatch in that mode where you turn off the marker for where you are? That feeling and like the thought that goes into it and how that feels as a player is just lost in a lot of games. And you're just like a fish with a hook in your mouth, like, oh, I'm going this way.
I absolutely agree. I think a lot of this is tied into developers not really trusting their players to be smart and to figure stuff out themselves. It's one of the things I can appreciate about more open-ended games. Like maybe the best one would be like The Outer Wilds, where it's just completely open and they're just like, yeah, we could walk you through with a crazy complex series of tutorials and guides and be like, oh, this is the main story objective marker. Go over here and investigate this area. But instead they're like, just go, have fun. If somebody wants that handheld experience, that's great. Like that's okay. They can get that by looking online and finding guides and stuff. If they really want it, that's out there. But the developers themselves are like trusting the player to go and put it together themselves. They don't need to hold their hand. They don't need to guide them that much. They just like, go figure it out. And I can really admire that, really appreciate it. And I think that you've seen a lot of games do this where they are bypassing the mini map and instead going to a compass. And I think that that's a good idea because the mini map just takes up so much screen real estate and players end up staring at that the whole time. Whereas a compass just gives you a broad idea of where you need to go. I still think probably the coolest implementation of this concept though, of just trusting your player, would be Ghost of Tsushima, where they just use the wind in the game and actually use the visual of the environment to direct you in a certain way. I think that was brilliant. And I'm still baffled we haven't seen more games do that since Ghost of Tsushima came out, but maybe we'll get that eventually. But I just think like, it was so great.
I will just spawn a new Sasquatch and murder him if I can, or just restart it. But they'll have fur simulations, like, so it's
wow.
actual hair, because UE has like this whole hair system. So there's like a regular model under there. Here, let me kill them all. Handy button, you gotta have the kill them all button.
You monster.
So I had to comb Bigfoot for my job. Because you grow the hair, and then you actually, like, there's a comb tool where you're like, the hair has to flow this way, and like a little bit shorter there, giving you a little trim.
I remember when I was doing 3D modeling a lot, I remember experimenting with the hair simulation tools in Blender and having to comb the hair too. It's pretty fun. It's weirdly satisfying.
Looks too nice. Let's make it a little messier. Like in the initial trailers, like there's this weird deer creature that has like tons of horns, way too many, or antlers, and people know what a deer is. So it's like, that's a deer, but weird. And like, makes more sense versus giant tree dude. You're like, what do I do? And I think it's kind of fun to have like little quirks to how each of them act and you fight. Also just like having that spectrum of which ones people know and understand. Like I basically have a Bigfoot. Like people know what that is. He's huge and scary, and he just kind of comes marching at you and takes a ton of arrows. He knocks you off of cliffs, super fun. But then some of them I was just like, I'm gonna go weird. And have some ones that people don't know what it is. Like there's one that's like this vortex of sand slowly coming towards you. And you're like, is that even a creature? Like, what do I do? So this is my roadmap of what I've done so far and what's left on the game. So I started the game around June of 2021. And first I made the prototype and finished it in around August. And played for like 5 minutes, hunt a monster, that's about it. By December 2021, you could play for about an hour and you could like actually level up, creatures would respawn. It was more like a real game at that point. So after that, I moved on to the systems and finished that in April. And that's like everything I need for the game. All the different arrows, powers, it all works in an open world, you can save. It's all the stuff, frankly, I was worried about, especially because my background is in art, but that all went great. And then I just finished up the full open world map, and that has 6 different regions. It's massive, it's like 5 times the size of Skyrim. The full world is now all there. I like to assume that no one knows about my game, no one cares. It's like, I might have a little bit of a leg up because I worked on Skyrim and Fallout and all these other things, but all that really does is open up some initial doors. So I'm not gonna do that.
From the maker of Skyrim.
Yeah. Sold 1 million copies, not happening. So I think it's very, very wise to assume no one gives a shit. So I have this strategy, I suppose, of trying to get out there early and try as many things as possible, because you also don't know what's gonna stick. Like sometimes a random screenshot Saturday that I do on Twitter ends up being bigger than like some IGN article or something. Like you don't know what is gonna really resonate with people. So putting out a lot of things and seeing what sticks can be helpful to get those wish lists to continue to go up, and like that's a uphill battle. Overall, I probably spend like 20% of my time on marketing stuff, but it's very variable. Like at the start, it's a spike, but then it goes down, and then something goes viral, and it goes up again and down, and then something else. It's like overall, it's in a spot that I'm happy with. Like, I don't know, people can like check this on Steam DB. I'm like, oh, I'm just shy of like top 500 wish list. That seems like a good spot for just one person. That said, I'd rather aim like super high because you don't know how it's gonna go until you ship. I'm trying to keep it a little loose. Like I haven't set a hard deadline for next year, but I did like put a stake in the sand. I was like, this is not gonna be like an 8-year indie project. Like I am gonna ship this thing. What I have left to do at this point is basically I'm spending the rest of this year building out all of the locations in the map because I've got the systems, I've got the world, I've got the creatures. So then I just need to put in the locations, which in a way is like eye candy, like not to diminish it, and like there's thought and level design and clutter and all these things that go in, but it's like technically I could ship the game without any of those. So at the same time, I'm also iterating on the game itself now that all of those things are in place. By the end of this year, have all the locations in, and then next year is all about shipping. Fix the bugs, localization, which consoles am I going on? Am I doing the porting? Is someone else doing the porting? The millions of marketing things that go into that and lining that all up. I vet all my ideas with my wife too, and we like talk about the narrative stuff and how it all goes together. Like she is
The Axis
like
Unseen.
an MD, PhD, and all in like medical stuff. So very different worlds.
I think I know how he's affording to do this now. It's like, how do you leave like a job you've been at for 14 years? And like, I've heard that working at BGS is not bad. Like it's pretty good, but like I've not heard that they are rolling in the Benjamins unless you're like pretty high up. So even then, like not necessarily. I think Todd's doing really well, but everybody else is kind of in the regular range for working in a company like this. So it's like, how did he afford to just like leave that job and go and work on an indie project for years without a regular salary? Like, I know maybe you could like Kickstarter it or something, but now if he's got a spouse that works in medicine, okay, I think that's how, which good for him. I mean, that's good for you. And good for her also being willing to like kind of support it and tell him like, yeah, we're down for you to do that. That's great. A lot of spouses would be like, wait, what? You want to leave your job? No, like, we're not doing that. We're not doing that.
But she understands how big skulls should be.
Yes, not, I believe that one is like, I don't know, 200 feet tall or something at the top of a mountain. Not a regular one.
The Axis Unseen. That's cool. A funky potato and a potato.
Yeah, look, she wants to jump up.
Yeah, this is the most friendly cat in the world. Shows up when I'm trying to make all my videos. Jumping up.
There's something about people talking, I think, because it always happens in interviews, and whenever I'm filming stuff in my house as well. Whenever you start, people they think you're talking to them or something, and they come in, or I don't know what it
It's
is.
just always like, here, I'm just gonna knock my monitors off.
Excellent. West Virginia up there as well.
Yeah, that's the 76 map, and I erased all the things that I shouldn't have up there about release dates.
Apologies, you'll have to write them all again when I leave.
Yeah, I took a picture. This is kind of funny. I put up all these like random things. Like I put up the bow that I have, because I'm working on a game with archery, so I should have an actual bow. Like I had one when I was growing up too, but I also got this when I was growing up, which is kind of absurd, because it's like, I thought I was remembering this wrong for when I got this, but then I checked the date on it, and 1993. I got this when I was 11 years old. Like, so that's a Oregon style for you. You get a ridiculously huge knife when you're 11 years old. I'm not really sure what you're supposed to do with it. You know.
Good for him, man. Most likely he started working on the game before leaving his job. So I think he said he started on it in April of 21. Let's see. Game started June of 21. So June of 21, he said he was doing early stuff on Starfield when he left. So, I mean, he might have put a little bit of time in before leaving. I'm not sure if they said when he left. We could try partway through Starfield's development. He decided to leave the studio. Yeah, so I don't know. It just says he left I don't think it says when. Yeah, a lot of this stuff in Skyrim and Fallout is frankly people doing what they wanted to do. You can tell the passion that those games were made with when you explore them. I've seen how hard Nate has been working on this project for a long time. It was great to see everything broken down by Danny at Noclip once again. It's also nice to hear that the devs agreed with fans regarding NPCs being in Fallout 76. Hearing Nate talk about Unreal Engine is like a breath of fresh air. Is quite eye-opening. Yeah, that's what really stands out to me, is that he's talking about Unreal, and like when he's initially showing it off, like he's just like, look at this cool thing it can do. Look at this. How cool is this? How cool is that? And like this art style wouldn't work in another engine because of the nanite stuff that it can do, and then the like specific shadow casting it can do. And like he's just giddy about it. It's really cool to see. And like I'm sure he probably has some like non-competes, and he's probably signed some stuff that are like non-disparagement clauses, which are pretty common with companies that are publicly facing, where like if I have an employee hypothetically and they were going to leave after working for me for a while, I think it would make sense to sign a non-disparagement clause. Like, yeah, you can't leave and then immediately start like bad mouthing. That's pretty normal. I've had to sign those where I've worked with companies and things have not worked out for various reasons. And as part of our agreement, like we sign non-disparagement clauses. They can't talk bad about me. I can't talk bad about them. It just kind of protects everybody from just being nasty if something goes wrong, which I think makes sense. I think that's reasonable. So he might have had to sign something like that. And then he also, let's just be honest, he still has friends working at BGS. So it's not like he wants to bash them, but you can just tell that he's loving the new tech that he gets to experiment with. But it makes me really wonder, like, if there was something that really pushed him, if he was just getting burnt out on Starfield, or if he was feeling that this wasn't what he wanted to be doing. And maybe, I mean, it sounds like he got into the leadership role, so he was doing a lot of management stuff and meetings and stuff, and it maybe was not what he wanted to be doing. He wanted to actually make games again, so he just decided to go do his own thing. And maybe his wife, like he said, is in medicine. Maybe she got the good paying job and was like, hey, let's just do it. You want to make your own games? Go make your own game. We'll do it. So that's awesome. Good for him, man. Good for him. He took my thing.